Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Benuli. Today we have Jacob Shapiro and Ira Harris. Jacob is Director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments, and he has earned a reputation as a prolific researcher, writer, and analyst who embraces unconventional thinking and direct client collaboration. He believes in challenging traditional perspectives and ideas to give clients the agency to proactively solve business problems. And Ira is hedge fund manager, global trader in foreign currencies, bonds, commodities, and equities for over 40 years. He served as CME director from 1997 to 2003 and also a stint most recently. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks.
Great. I thought we begin first with your overall perspective on the macro view for the global economy and the financial markets before we get into geopolitical risks. Your thoughts, Jacob?
Sure. Well, it's hard for someone like me to separate the geopolitics from the macro environment, especially where we are right now. But I can tell you that in general, I'm somebody who has been looking at where energy is going and thinking that we're in this weird sort of energy paradigm shift where everybody's going towards renewables, but we've had a couple of years of underinvestment in the normal fossil fuels and hydrocarbons that still power the majority of the economy. So I'm honestly, I've been pretty bullish on the energy sector in general, things like natural gas, oil, even coal. And I think playing that energy transition is going to be one of the big themes here going forward. I also think sort of the U.S. has outperformed here for years, but I think we're in this shift where I think international is going to start taking over. I'm most interested in emerging markets that are exporting commodities that are going to be in high demand. So, for instance, I'm very interested in countries like Chile and Brazil that are exporting things like corn and soybeans or copper, all things which, as we're seeing under this geopolitical stress test we're undergoing with the Russia-Ukraine war, are popping up because I think those things, whether we were having this war or not, were going to be the ones that were going to be primed to overperform. So that's sort of my very, very high level macro perspective.
Great. And your initial thoughts, Ira?
Well, this is going to be a very interesting discussion. As I put out the blog last night, so where Jacob's looking at the emerging markets that are exporters, I'm looking at the impact of what it's going to mean for emerging markets who have to import food and energy. And, last night in my blog, I went back to the late 70s and early 80s when I was a trader, but I had actually gotten out of graduate school in 76, 77, and had studied so much, especially from the Marxist and Austrian viewpoint, about the amount of debt that was piled on to what we called then third world countries, or better, less developed countries, and the burden that they had to undertake and what it did to the global financial system. So I'm sure this will go back and forth because I think this is a of major importance, because as these costs rise, food costs and energy costs, and I think that Jacob is dead right on target with that. But the impact on these economies, especially as the dollar, which is of course prices everything in the commodity world, is just rose 4 or 5%. So it becomes a greater burden on them because they're so heavily borrowed in dollars, even with uber low interest rates. So I think this will make for an interesting discussion. I'm waiting to hear his views. So that's where I would go with it.
And in that regard, Jacob, what do you see in terms of the U.S. dollar? Do you see the current geopolitical events as being the end to the petrodollar system, and could this be negative to the US dollar reserve currency status?
Well, so those are two separate things for me. So I'd pull those apart. There's sort of the petrodollar system, and then there's the dollar status as a global reserve currency. The petrodollar system was already on the way out for the simple fact that since the shale revolution, the United States has been primed to be an oil exporter and an LNG exporter. It's no longer importing these things. So the whole logic of the petrodollar system was the U.S. was going to be buying oil from Saudi Arabia in particular, and everything was going to get priced in dollars, and that's how we were going to get away from the previous system. So I think we were actually undergoing a shift there already. If you look at how countries like China, for instance, or India were settling their payments, the dollar's role was already in decline. The euro, ironically, was taking a much larger position. Then you sort of have, the yuan just very slightly starting to go from 1% to 2%, growing fast, but still in sort of absolute terms, very, very small. So I think the U.S. status as an energy superpower, and it's going to be an energy superpower for at least the next couple decades, was already causing some changes in that and sort of how markets deal with energy in general. That's very different than the global reserve currency, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. And if you go back and look at the history of reserve currencies, and there haven't been that many because we haven't been in a globalized world for that long, you've got the pound, you've got the franc. We can get really nerdy and go to the Dutch guilder if you want to. But every one of those global reserve currencies stopped being a reserve currency as a result of a major cataclysmic war. So the franc stops being a reserve currency because of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The pound really loses its status in the context of World War I especially, but World War II is sort of the death blow. So you don't get those types of shifts. A shift in reserve currency is not something that happens to me over a long period of time. It's something that happens very rapidly because the cost is something that everybody has to bear because we're in a crisis. And I guess that helps me put some perspective in the current Russia-Ukraine war, because even in the context of probably the most serious war in Europe, certainly in the last 20 years and probably longer than that, we're nowhere close to anyone saying, I want to be paid in yuan, not in dollars. One of the first things the Chinese did when all this happened was they said to the Russians, okay, great, we're not going to pay you in dollars or euros anymore. We're going to pay you in yuan. So you can see them trying to take advantage of that, but that's a very, very small sample size. Most people still want dollars and rush to things like dollars and gold and the traditional safe havens. So I don't think we're in, I guess I should say, I don't think the world is upside down yet. And it would really take the world going upside down for the US dollar to lose its status. I will say, however, that one of the things, on the road to World War I and on the road to the pound losing its status, you can go back and look at British debt and what happened to it in the 19th century. It skyrocketed, in part because they had to fight against France, and then they just kind of got derelict. They just started spending because they were the most powerful power, and they did whatever they wanted. And I think there are some very interesting parallels between Victorian British Empire and where the U.S. is today that don't augur well for where the U.S. is going the next 2 to 3 decades. But here today, it's the dollar is the reserve currency, and it's not changing anytime soon, in my opinion.
Interesting. And your thoughts, Ira?
Well, I was more interested in going back to the Gilder. I was brushing off my Giovanni Arrighi so I could really get in depth on the Gilder. But when you said that, I get excited because there's not many people we can have this discussion with.
Here I am.
The Dutch were some of the greatest financiers, and they did it without running an empire militarily. So they set really some great examples for the world about how to do some of this. I think the dollar, and I've written quite a bit about it, it's not ready to go yet. It could be pushed, but it depends on a lot of things. And I think that, and unfortunately, the role of the reserve currency, and I think Jacob's point about the US becoming a net exporter of energy changes, of course, the petrodollar, but we saw how quick the Federal Reserve had to take on its third mandate, which it never wanted to accept, which is the global funder of last resort. And we're in it now. And I think that's going to help it in the short term here, because back in July of 2021, when Powell was actually pushed into it, I think by the G30, and when the FOMC announced it at that July meeting for the standing repo facility, is such a huge of importance because it provides liquidity in an immediate sense to the global system. Everybody's making the swap lines, of course, are important, but that's standing repo facility, and especially with its foreign component, really is important. Otherwise, I think we'd be in the middle of a global financial crisis right now. But the world is pretty complacent that there's all the dollars that they could possibly want available. Well, we'll find out up to a point, but I think that the United States, I think sanctions are undermining the dollar, and it's just not with the Biden administration. This has been going on. It's been the answer to everything. We won't sacrifice any soldiers, but we will be quick to strangle your financial abilities to operate. And if you see it, it's having repercussions, and it's having. I'm just looking at the European bank stocks. I'm waiting for some announcement from the ECB, from Lagarde, about an extension of the Teltro program, because the Teltro 3 was supposed to roll off in June of 2022, but there is evidently, and I'm just looking at debt and bank stocks in Europe. There's a lot of stress in the system. We don't know where it is yet, but it's somewhere. And that's going to call a lot of questions, by the way, because the Germans are going to find out really quick how much they're on the hook for directly. So that plays against the dollar being undermined as a reserve currency in the short term. But I do think that there are issues with the dollar, a lot of it brought on by policy decisions over the last 25 years, with the knee-jerk to go to sanctions everywhere and any place possible. So the dollar status is a little shaky, and I think that's why gold goes up. Gold's not going up because of inflation. Gold goes up because of central bank, the lack of, or the questionable credibility of central banks in a fiat currency world. And I think that's where we're at, and that's what makes the dollar shaky. But again, everybody else is doing the best they can because they don't want to be the reserve currency. Nobody's seeking the reserve currency status at that point, because, as Michael Pettis is quick to say, it's not an exorbitant privilege, it's an exorbitant burden. And I think that's what the world is busy fighting with right now.
And in terms of, if we look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, Jacob, do you see China aligning more with Russia sooner or later? And also, what are the implications for a potential alternative SWIFT system in development? Like, is there a timeline for that in terms of when that could happen?
Yeah, I just want to echo what was just said, which is there's actually a great study by the Peterson Institute that goes back to 1970 and found that unilateral U.S. sanctions were only effective 13% of the time in actually achieving their desired policy. So I couldn't agree more with the point about the overemphasis on sanctions. I think China's relationship to Russia has been fundamentally misunderstood by most of the West, and probably by Russia as well. If you actually read the Chinese foreign minister, it's Monday, March 7th, had a whole press conference today where he was talking about the rock solid relationship between China and Russia. But when you actually read through the lines, he talked about how the China-Russia relationship is based on anti-alliance, anti-threats to sovereignty and things like that. So it's not that China sees itself as an ally to Russia. It sees that Russia has a sphere of influence and China has a sphere of influence, and they both have a common interest in resisting the United States. But when you actually look at kind of long-term what's going to happen here, I've been joking that what Vladimir Putin has really done to Russia is he's transformed it overnight from a great European power into China's gas station for the long term, because that's all his economy is going to be from now on. And China's going to have all the leverage there. Not only that, from the Chinese perspective, one of the things that is driving Xi Jinping in Taiwan in centralizing control is that he's making up for the century of humiliation in the 1800s and the early 1900s when China couldn't really defend itself. Japan took parts of China, and the British took Hong Kong, and Taiwan was Portuguese. I mean, everybody was sort of taking whatever Chinese territory they wanted, including the Russians. Vladivostok, which is the base of Russia's navy in the Pacific, was a Chinese city. And I guarantee you that the Chinese would like to get their hands back on that one day. And I can also guarantee you that they're very happy to see Russia squirm and import all of this wheat and all of this oil that nobody else wants on the market. So from my perspective, there's an alignment here between China and Russia, but they are not allies. What they are really both angling for here, and India we might also throw in this category, is they don't like the way the global liberal international order, whatever you want to call what the US constructed after World War II, they think it's a raw deal for them. And they would like some new rules, and they would like some rules that recognize what they have done. And they want to enjoy going up the value chain, and they want to protect their industry so that they can have some better things. So China will cooperate with Russia as long as it is in its interest to do so. And as long as the US has sanctions on both China and Russia and treats both China and Russia like these evil empires that are peer rivals, we will drive China and Russia into each other's waiting arms. But if I was a Russian strategic decision maker, I would be terrified of the steps that Putin has taken, because I've basically just levered my future to China, and China is going to be, and already is in many ways, a much more powerful country than Russia. In terms of the SWIFT system, no, there's no good alternative. You can still have global trade without SWIFT. SWIFT is kind of a messaging platform. It makes things a lot different. But I think that's all been kind of overblown. SWIFT is not the thing to be watching for. The thing to be watching for is, do the Europeans stomach sanctions or restrictions on the export of Russian energy? And just today, the Germans said, no, we're not here for that. So as long as that is the case, there's a lot of signaling, there's a lot of making things difficult, but I don't think we're at a place where, we're not at a place where Russia can't sell natural gas to Europe and where Europe can't pay for it, even though they've taken some Russian banks out of SWIFT. So,
well, very interesting. And your thoughts, Ira?
No, these are great points. Again, Richard, what do? Set me up with people who only, this is like as they say, it's a shidduch. That's, I'm not sure about his family, but he makes a point, and I was just talking about it this morning where I was in a room giving some advice, that Graham Allison's Thucydides trap is such an important part of our thinking. And Graham Allison was no fan of the idea that the Kennan school, which was about containment, that without containment, the spread of liberal democracy would have been a myth. That's not the way the US operated, but it was under that umbrella that we spread that. So, I mean, these are phenomenally important points, and how China goes is interesting. And that goes back to, I had joked with Mark Faber that, well, Putin and Xi are allies, so maybe China's going to send 7,500 troops to the Ukrainian border, like the US sent 7,500 troops. And Faber rightfully said, no, Putin wouldn't like that because he knows he'll never get rid of them, which I know that historically, China and Russia have been at each other, the Soviet Union. And when I look at what Putin has done here, I truly thought that think that he would be pulling out in about 3 weeks, that he would mimic what China did by invading Vietnam in 1979. Even though China endured massive losses, they were politically successful by forcing Vietnam to move further away from the Soviet Union, which China was very fearful of. So yes, China took a beating because the Vietnamese were a hardened army. But for 3 weeks, they rained 800,000 artillery shells. They caused massive destruction. And they basically said, here's the message. How often do you want to do this? And the Vietnamese did that. And I think that's what Putin, nobody knows, everybody's guessing. The new thing on television, of course, is to guess what's in Putin's mind. There are more people guessing, but let's see, if the Russians were to unilaterally pull back and go, okay, you get the message? There will be no Ukraine, NATO, there'll be no Ukraine, EU, just in case you were thinking about it. And we'll be out of here, and everything will go that way, and let's see what we can do. So the American foreign policy establishment is licking their chops. thinking that the Russians are walking into a quagmire and will be burdened down here. I just don't see that happening. Maybe I'm naive, but I just don't see that. And they have to be careful because as the sanctions bite, they're biting more than the U.S. intended, and they're biting Europe hard. All I do is have to look at all my European bank stocks that I have up on it to see how hard these are biting, because the European bank stock, the financials up until 3 weeks ago, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, Santander, Unic, they were all doing pretty well. Now all of a sudden they have dropped 35 to 40% quickly. So there's something underlying, and it's just not the fare. Somebody sees some vulnerabilities, and it's due to the sanctions. So we were going to have to be very careful. And I will state this too. Deng Xiaoping made the point, and I'm from Ezra Vogel's book, wonderful book on Deng Xiaoping, that when the world put sanctions on China after Tiananmen Square, it actually hardened the Communist Party, and they became more popular because nationalism was on the rise then in China. That was one of the negative fallouts. And then, of course, Deng got relief from those sanctions when the UN voted in, I believe, in November 1990, because the US needed their support to get a UN security resolution for the invasion of Iraq, or to find some way to deal with Iraq. So those were rolled back. And these all play part and parcel. You can't diminish or dismiss these as having no place. They have a place. And Putin, see, I don't believe that Putin's as mad as people think, or he's off the rails. Yeah, I think he is a far better strategist than that. So we'll see where this goes. But I think Jacob's point is dead right on target in about the China and Russia differentials. And right now, as Kissinger and Brzezinski warned 2 decades ago, the worst foreign policy could be to drive them into each other's arms. And you know what? It's exactly what they've done here. And in that way, it's a massive failure at this juncture. Things can change dramatically, but it's a mistake.
Do you have insights or thoughts, Jacob, on geopolitical risks on the European banking financial system, as I was referencing? Any ideas there?
Just that any weakness there is an opportunity from my perspective. I don't think Putin is mad or crazy or off his rocker or anything, but I do think he's made a miscalculation. I do think he could have gotten most of what he wanted out of all of this using the political leverage that he developed already. He was already getting everything that he wanted in the first place. So I'm not sure exactly why or what he thinks he gets out of going into Ukraine. In some ways, he has hardened Ukraine in particular against him. He sees now that there is going to be serious resistance. They've made Zelensky into a hero, and God forbid, I don't want them to make him into a martyr, but I kind of worry about what his future is like, given how defiant he has been towards Russia. But the other thing that Putin has done here, and this is why I think it was a miscalculation, is that for all the problems that Europe has, and they love squabbling with each other, and they never actually do anything, and it's all talk. Suddenly, they're not just talking; they're doing. I mean, the Germans have devoted 100 billion euros to modernizing their military in the next 2 years. Chills go down my spine when I talk about Germans militarizing. I'm not so comfortable with it, but that's what they're saying. And it's not just the Germans. The Danes have a new military spending defense package. The Poles have a new military defense spending package. You kind of look throughout the bloc, and the external threats that Europe seems to be facing is papering over some of those internal divisions. The best example of this is Hungary, which has been the redheaded stepchild of the EU for years now, and which has been pro-Moscow and reaching out to Beijing. Viktor Orban said today, yes, NATO troops can come hang out on my territory, and there can be NATO weapons on my territory. I mean, that's mind-boggling. You wouldn't have thought that 3 weeks ago. And that's all because Russia decided to go after Ukraine, and because Ukraine's defenders, to their credit, have completely dominated the information war. They have presented a picture to the rest of Europe and to the rest of the Western world as, it's David versus Goliath, and we're all together in this, and we want to be part of the West, and all that sort of good stuff. So you asked about the sort of geopolitical risks to European financial sector. I'm bullish the EU in general, because I think what we're seeing here is Europe is waking up, and I think that over time you're going to see the EU actually become more and more powerful and assert more and more control in a way that it hadn't been able to before, because now it has a narrative to hang its hat on. It can now say, hey, Russia is threatening us and China is threatening us, and we have to completely redo our energy dependencies, and we have to completely rebuild our militaries, and we have to have supply chains that are inside Europe. We have to build our own semiconductors. You kind of go down the list of the things that Europe is doing. Those are all, Europe's a very powerful economy, and it does things when it gets on the same page, and they look like they're getting on the same page to me.
Just your thoughts on that, Hera?
It's the same reason I'm buying, and for me to buy European Financial, which I was doing, and actually, Commerzbank was a great plan. I'm back to even on it after seeing quite an appreciation. I think there's, and I keep looking at this, and they're beating the hell out of the DAX, and I keep looking at it and going, and when, I'm trying to find good levels of entry, because Siemens, these and Krupp, these are going to be recipients of this type of fiscal stimulus that we have never seen. And I think the biggest loser is France, because anytime you talk about Germany, because the French viewed themselves in the whole EU project as being the military part of it, and the German economic engine would be the locomotive pulling everything and making everything possible. Now there's been a fly in the ointment. The French do have an advantage here, is that they're laden with nuclear energy, because it's been a state policy to support EDF and everybody else who makes their money from the French nuclear business. So right now they're on the upper hand. But if I'm them, Macron, who is a pure Gaullist at heart, as I read him, has now had a little comeuppance here. And it's the worst outcome for him, is that Germany starts to get a little more self-sufficient in the military end and starts, I'm not going to say spreading its wings yet, but I'm with Jacob. My family is laying on the battlefields of Europe. To tell you that my father left on a boat in 1923 from Odessa will tell you what they've endured and what my history knows about it, what my family history dictates. So you're always nervous with it, but Putin, he can't be proud of that. And we still need to find Gerhard Schroeder, because he's a little too important in this whole equation. Somebody was the chancellor of Germany, and I would say a pretty good chancellor at that time, who fabricated an election he didn't have to hold, lost, and then went to work for Gazprom, after he, of course, put in all the legislative elements to creating German dependency on Russian natural gas. So, and then Merkel finished the job by turning off the reactors. So there are many things here in shift, but I think Jacob is right. Europe now takes on a different place. And I think that Putin had, in fact, had intended that at first, to drive a further wedge between the US and Europe. And I'm not sure that's still not going to take place, by the way. Forget about the first responses, when everybody steps back and sees the damage and what happens with these sanctions. And does Europe break away from the sanctions very quickly in order to restore some type of stronger relationship with Russia? Because there's no getting away from them right now, none. And you have Italy, who certainly sees the world through some Russian eyes. Draghi has to be careful, but I think Jacob is dead right on target.
Mm-hmm. The organization known as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, Jacob, do you see that organization as the NATO of the East, and what effects could they have, are they having geopolitically and on the financial markets and the global economy?
No, I don't see them as NATO of the East. And I mean, NATO is a very specific thing. NATO was a military alliance that was designed to stop the Soviet Union from overrunning Western Europe. It had mission creep. It's been expanding. Ironically, Putin has given it new purpose. I thought it was probably going to die within 5 or 10 years if they kept on their current track. When they threw a big party for Montenegro coming in, said this is the future of NATO, I was like, okay, great, you have Montenegro. I'm not sure what that does. But in some ways, NATO has new life. But the SCO isn't going to have a singular purpose like that. And I think this is kind of, we're moving from a world where we had kind of one global power or even two global powers, as we did during the Cold War, to a more multipolar world. So it's not going to be about one bloc versus another bloc, and it's not going to be the US NATO bloc versus the Shanghai bloc, and that's going to be it. For me, the world is starting to resemble a lot. It's starting to resemble the world in the decades before World War I. So I think the 1890s are the mental maps you want to have on your head. It's not going to be about organizations that are locked in place in competition against each other. It's going to be shifting relationships that are pragmatic. And it's what have you done for me lately? And how do I protect my own supply chains and things like that? So, China's going to have its little sphere of influence, and Russia's going to fight for its sphere of influence. Watching Turkey squirm amid all of this because they're a rising power as well, but horribly dependent on Russia for imports of food and energy and things like that. But they have those kinds of aspirations to kind of return to, their old Ottoman territories. India, if it can ever get out of its own way, has a lot of things going for it. We talked about the Dutch for a second earlier. I think Indonesia would talk a little bit about how peaceful the Dutch were in their imperial rise. It wasn't all perfect. Brazil we're about to have Lula coming back in Brazil, which the last time he was in office, I'm assuming here Bolsonaro is going to lose. Anything can, I guess I shouldn't assume such things, but I'm pretty confident if things stay how they are right now that Lula's going to come back. The last time Lula was back, it was all about the BRICS and South Africa and Brazil and Russia and China, India, the future, this, that, and the other thing. So I wouldn't focus any too much on one organization. I would try and identify those key poles of power and which powers are going to rise and which are going to decline. And then you kind of work your way back from there. So the Shanghai organization, an important one for sure, but not the only one, not NATO. It's kind of got its own thing. And it's really about, the interests of those particular countries across Eurasia and how they're going to balance against each other and balance against the West.
Very interesting. And your thoughts, Ira?
You know what? That really covers it well, but I'm glad Jacob talked about Turkey, because the real, to me, and I've been on this for 10, 11, 12 years, because Erdogan is a megalomaniac waiting to happen. If he could get anything done right, he would like to exercise that, because he would like to reestablish, from everything that I've read and continue to read, he wants to establish the Ottoman Caliphate. Well, the Caliphate can only exist if you control Mecca and Medina anyway, as far as I understand it, because without Mecca and Medina, you don't have the religious foundation to be able to do it. So, but Erdogan is really dangerous here, because last week I was hearing comments about closing the Bosphorus Straits to Russian shipping. Well, if you want to escalate this into a full-blown NATO, because, and this is why NATO is an atavistic remnant of the past, because Turkey is a real problem. Because Russia and Turkey could go to war at any time. And you almost saw it in 2015 when Turkey wanted to crush the Kurds, as usual. The US gave their nod and agreement. The poor Turks have suffered terribly. And the Russians were very active. And there was a Russian plane shot down by the Turks, and things get a little hot. So under Article 5 of NATO, does the US come, if Russia and Turkey go to war, which is a possibility because Erdogan is nuts enough, I believe. You want to talk about somebody who's imbalanced. Erdogan is very imbalanced. And I'm sorry if that offends some people, but all you do is have to look to see what he's done, from the false coup to many other things. If he were to close the Bosphorus Straits, all hell will break loose. So anybody who thinks that that's a good idea to prevent Russian shipping, and I would argue that that's why Putin had to take Crimea back, by the way, because Crimea was always meant to protect Russian shipping and naval through the Bosphorus, the same as Guantanamo protects the Gulf of Mexico. There's no difference. Why does the United States maintain a naval base in Cuba? Because it protects the greatest food flow in the world from down through New Orleans out through the Gulf of Mexico. So it's really no different. Do not go that route. If you want to escalate this, and people say, well, why would that do it? I said, you remember the '67 war? Why Israel had to launch an attack against the Arab nations? They closed off Israeli shipping to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. That is an act of war by anybody's nature. Do not go that route. Don't even think about it. But and that makes the whole NATO concept where the vulnerabilities lie.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for an hour just about Turkey. That's how interesting Turkey is in this whole thing. I will say, well, I'll say a couple of things. So, I mean, according to the Montreux Convention, they can shut down the Bosporus to military ships in times of war, and that's what they've done. They have said that they're shutting it down to all military ships, so not just the Russians ones. That's what they're hiding behind right now. I'll also say it's the Russians who have effectively closed the Bosporus right now because all Ukrainian commercial ports are closed, and cargo ships that are in the area have been receiving, whether it's accidental fire or whatever. I mean, ships aren't going in and out of the Black Sea really right now, which is why you're seeing the price spike in things like wheat and corn, which will get a lot worse if we get to the Ukrainians planting season here in a couple of weeks and they can't plant crops. But right now you're seeing those price spikes because those ships aren't getting out, and there's just all of that grain is sitting there and it's not getting out. But as for Erdogan, I don't think he's crazy. He might be wrong in the end. He might lose quite a bit for what he's trying to do. But I think he's actually a great example of what we're talking about with what we were talking about before with the global reserve currency. One of the amazing things to think about with Turkey is that just it's 2022. Yeah, it's 2022. In 2019 or 2020, it was facing off against France and Libya, and you had French frigates and Turkish naval ships locking onto each other with radar in the Mediterranean Sea. That was just 2 or 3 years ago because Turkey was trying to show it up and trying to kind of assert its own geopolitical influence in the region. And when you look at, for instance, what Turkey and what Erdogan in particular is doing with the Turkish lira, he's not doing that stuff with the Turkish lira because he believes that nonsense about interest rates in the Quran. He's doing that because he levered his economy to cheap US dollar denominated debt, and he needs to get off of that as quickly as he possibly can because he doesn't want the Fed to tank his economy. So he may fail. It may all blow up in his face. But I see what he wants. He wants to have more dependence for Turkish monetary policy going forward, and he wants to not be so beholden to the dollar going forward because Turkey is the only really mature industrial economy in the entire Middle East. I mean, the Saudis are just an oil pump in the middle of nowhere. The Iranians haven't been able to do anything. And then, I mean, Israel's a wonderful story, but it's too small to sort of do anything at scale. So I think that's what he's going for. And I think to Ira's point, like, that's why Turkey has been so cautious and ambivalent since the beginning of this crisis. So they use the Montreux Convention. They say they're shutting things down, but then they call Putin and say they want to be the ones who host the negotiations, and then they don't actually sign on to the energy sanctions because they're the ones importing all the energy. They're playing all sides here, and I do think they're too weak to go for anything right now. And Erdogan's facing a pretty intense election coming up in the next year. But 5-10 years down the road, I think we will all be talking about Turkey and about what Turkey is doing in the region and how it's asserting itself. And from that point of view, I think they are very dangerous and very opportunistic and an interesting opportunity in general.
No, those are really good points. And when people ask me about the Russian ruble, well, the Russian ruble is a silly discussion because nobody can trade it. The banks have basically shut off the trading, so you can push it to wherever you want. But this is kind of interesting because relative to the Russian ruble, they both have actually collapsed about the same percentage over. Well, Russia's has all been in the last 3 weeks. Turkey over the last year, the currency went from 7 lira to the dollar to we're back to 14. We had gone all the way to 18. So they both kind of experience a similar collapse. Now, where's the ruble going to go? I can't tell you. If I'm right about what way Putin does this, I think the ruble will be back at 70 quickly. If he pulls back and you saw some easing of sanctions, especially from the Europeans. Erdogan is in a different situation, but with the central bank, because he's still trying to find his way. And I think I'm fascinated by Jacob's discussion about that. So I have to think about it more in those terms when I look at it. But the world is far more difficult than the sound bites that you hear, pounding your brain all day long. So, and I think that Jacob delineates it very well.
Mm-hmm. Overall, for the Russia-Ukraine crisis, do you see that as being resolved sooner, or it evolving into a longer-term situation, like into next year?
Well, let me start by saying that I didn't think they were going to invade in the first place. I got that totally wrong. So I'm a little trigger shy. You too. Well, I'm a little trigger shy about making predictions now that I got that one so wrong. But I've eaten my humble pie, and let me try and kind of come back at where I think it's going. I will say there have been a couple little tiny indicators that maybe I was right, and that maybe Putin is looking for a way out and to negotiate. For instance, apparently the Turks are going to host the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia for the first cabinet level discussions on Thursday since this whole thing started. There have been 3 rounds of Ukrainian-Russian negotiation near the Belarusian border, where they ostensibly each time agree to these civilian evacuation corridors, which the Russians keep bombing even after they agree to them, but they still keep talking. So the communication lines are open. They seem to be talking. That maybe tells you that Russia is interested in somehow getting to a point where it can say mission accomplished and pull back a little bit. I don't think that's the most likely scenario. What it looks like to me is that the Russians thought they were going to waltz in and there wasn't going to be a whole lot of opposition. And that got disproven very quickly. And what they now are doing, it seems to me, are coiling up for a more protracted military engagement here over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I see them moving to kind of crush Kiev, get rid of Zelensky, decapitate the government, install whoever they want, take over some key cities for a while, but then kind of pull back most of their forces. So I think this probably gets a lot uglier over the next 2 or 3 weeks if I'm reading kind of the way Russia's logistical supply chains are reorienting, the way they're trying to get their air force to assert itself more in conjunction with its land forces, which it hasn't really been able to do since the beginning of this conflict, that sort of thing. If this but that I'm talking about a 2 to 3 week timeline here. They have a 2 to 3 week timeline, I think, to make some military headway and then get to a sort of political accommodation point. If we are having this conversation 1 year from now, and Russia is either still trying to conquer Ukraine or is dealing with an insurgency in Ukraine, then probably Russian President Vladimir Putin is no longer president, and Russia is probably about to come apart at the seams. I don't see how Russia can expend itself on a year-long campaign or a year-long insurgency in Ukraine and continue with business as normal. Weeks, maybe a couple months, yes, but I mean, I don't care how many reserves you have. At a certain point, these sanctions are going to hit, and at a certain point, these Russians who have been spontaneously protesting in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, all around the country, they're going to blame Putin for exactly the same things they blamed Yeltsin, which was the economy is not doing well and people are dying and there's chaos. And the whole point of the social contract here was you get to be a dictator, but you give us stability. So if there's no stability by next year, it's very hard for me to imagine that Putin is still Putin or that Russia is still Russia. So I think we're operating on a week by week timetable here, and that Russia has a couple weeks to get their act together.
And your thoughts, Ira?
And I can't agree more. And I think that social contract, right, where he was, Putin did some, pretty good things, and people forget we had the most significant transference of wealth and power in a bloodless fashion following the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, when you think about what took place, and for the most part, it was bloodless. I mean, we won't get into what happened in the Balkans. The Balkans are always the Balkans. Personally, I think Bismarck was right. It's always a mess, but it was really bloodless. And then Putin was smart enough to pay off the pensioners, because the pensioners were never going to avail themselves of the change in Russia following the fall of the Soviet Union. So he did everything he could, and he reined in the oligarchs to do his bidding. Where it goes, I don't know, but I agree. If we're still talking about this a year, yeah, Putin then is as mad as some people want to proclaim, and the world is going to look far more different than we can even imagine anyway. For everything that'll come from the sanctions tightening and the collateral effects of unintended consequences will be, I think, devastating to certain aspects of the entire global financial system. So I think Jacob is dead right with that. There's no doubt about it. And I think that more people in the administration better start reading Graham Allison and the Thucydides Trap and taking it to the next level to understand how we're going to have to approach the world anyway. Because, you know, people who talk about, well, China's going to go into Taiwan. How much do you want on your plate for an administration that doesn't want to put any American soldiers at risk? So, and I think it's kind of a foolish thing to tell ahead of time, but that's where they were signaling that they really want no significant battle here.
And just a final overall question, Jacob, given all of these risks globally, the environment that we have, where do you see the opportunities from an investment perspective? You mentioned the emerging markets, areas of agriculture, commodities. Which countries, regions, and types of companies do you like the best?
Sure. So, I mean, I can tell you right now over at CI, I mean, our largest positions are gold and oil stocks and gas pipelines and things like that. We're very, very interested in emerging market economies around the fringes, like I talked about. So, I mean, some of those are major exporters like Brazil or like Chile. I'm also, I mean, I've already betrayed that I'm bullish Turkey, and I'm positioned that way accordingly. Also very bullish Japan, because if Japan is one of these countries like Germany that is going to wake up here and is going to realize that they don't live in the world that they lived in before, and they're going to have to figure out how to rejigger their economy and their defense and their political relationships in such a way so that they can defend themselves. In general, though, I would sort of think of it more more thematically, which is I'm interested in food, I'm interested in energy, and I'm interested in the future of technology. I've been banging on the table about food prices and food investing, literally, and you can go back on my Perch Perspectives website. I've been banging on the table since the pandemic started that food prices were already in an upward trend, that the pandemic was going to accelerate them, that all of this geopolitical competition was going to accelerate it. It's all happening, and we sort of had a brief preview of what this was going to look like when we had the food price hikes in 2008 and afterwards, and that sort of crisis. And we're just now getting back to where food prices were then. And the Arab Spring was predominantly a food price crisis. Like, all these sorts of things are going to happen in these parts of the world that are major food importers. Conversely, if you're in agricultural technology, or if you're in countries like Canada, where climate change is actually working to your benefit, where you're actually getting more arable land and you're able to produce more things and more people need your crops, like that's a really interesting place. Energy, I kind of alluded to. Right now, I think you want to be oil, natural gas, coal, as dirty as you can possibly get, the children that have been left behind that nobody wanted. Like, those are the ones that are going to soar here in the next year or two. The IEA was talking about how there's going to be record coal prices again for another year this year. There's a gap between supply and demand because there's been malinvestment in there for years. That's where you kind of want to be right now. Long term, though, and by long term, I mean 3 to 5 years, we're undergoing a major shift. So whether it's going to be solar or wind or nuclear or hydrogen, I just say yes to all of them. You want to kind of have your fingers in all of those different buckets. I'm particularly interested in hydrogen because I think the natural gas infrastructure can be retrofitted to help hydrogen. And I think hydrogen scales at a better rate than batteries. But, now we're getting kind of, fanciful in 5 years down the road. What I do know is you want to be watching all these technological developments in energy and positioning yourself accordingly as we see where things are going. And then I mentioned tech. I think the future of tech, the tech world really mirrored the geopolitical reality in which it was a unipolar world and everything was free trade and everything was efficiency and leanness and just in time. And that's not happening anymore. One of the things that Russia said just today is that they're cutting themselves off from the global internet, and they've been building their own internal internet for the last couple of years so that they can do that. Apply that across the spectrum on tech. So there's going to be Chinese tech and Russian tech and European tech and US tech. All these folks are going to be building their own self-sufficient tech industries because you have to do that in Industry 4.0 and in the economy that we're kind of racing towards. And there will be losers in that. Anybody who, any company or country that is depending on that kind of global system of trade working frictionlessly, like, those are losers. But if you have those countries that are powerful enough to assert themselves, that can build their own infrastructures, there will be companies that benefit from that. And there will be countries like Brazil, like Turkey, like the European Union, like Iran, if it can ever rejoin the world. Those are some of the countries that I would be focused on from kind of the reorganization of supply chain perspective.
Awesome, interesting. And your idea, Ira?
I agree. And with Japan, I have my son is one of the foremost experts on Japanese foreign policy. So I agree on Japan. And believe me, it's worrisome. One of the negative fallouts for Xi and Putin is the noise that came from Japan very quickly about Article 9 of the Japanese. They were, all of a sudden you had Abe out there last week talking about things that Putin has to really think about these things too, because it doesn't work to his advantage either. That everybody living under the U.S. nuclear umbrella has kept the world a lot tamer. But everything that Jacob talks about, I mean, if I look at all I do is in Stockwise invest for myself, but Ballard Power has been on my list since the Chinese bought 25% of it. The Japanese, of course, are big proponents of hydrogen. They're just trying to figure it out between Honda and Toyota. They've got massive amounts of money invested into seeking a hydrogen solution to an energy. So all these things I see, and I agree with. Food has, of course, been a mainstay. The thing that flies in my face, it's hard to believe that Canada, and I know they have to overcome Trudeau and what he did with the truckers, which was to me so foolish in so many ways. But Canada is the antibody to Russia, because it's a vast land with, as you point, the Manitoba, Alberta. Great. Last year they had terrible growing seasons because they were in drought. Rich in all kinds of minerals, energy. Unbelievable how rich they are, with access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific. So why Canada doesn't get a bid here is beyond me. It's just not because oil going. And last week, the Bank of Canada actually raised interest rates ahead of everybody else. So I see that too. And, I'm scouring the world. I'm happy to say I'm in an investment with some smart people who bought large amount of farmland down in Uruguay, because I understand that, it's Brazil that's the largest soybean grower in the world. This is a major change. And what Jacob talks about, even prior to COVID, the fact that soybeans only went down to $9.50, $10. $10 beans for American farmers were an enormous price. And that became the support level. So it was easy to see. And we did a lot of discussions about this, Richard, with many people from Louis Gavet through Faber and Zuloff. So we've talked about this in these podcasts, which has been, China bent the food curve long ago. You're just not, and now India is coming on, even though they were the first recipient of, course, the Green Revolution. So all these things are massively important. And as John Desard and others have laid out so brilliantly about the effects on the fertilizer and the growing season in Europe this year, Europe has to be very careful. And the Chinese quietly stockpile a whole lot of things, right? Copper, steel, let's keep going. And they've done it with a strong yuan, which has kind of flown in the face of conventional thinking, who thought when COVID caused the global economy to turn down, well, the Chinese would put downward pressure on the yuan to ensure their export markets. Absolutely the opposite took place. The yuan next to the Israeli shekel was the best performing currency in the world. And they held their ground. And they didn't do that without the Chinese wanting a stronger yuan. And why would you want a stronger yuan? Because a stronger currency enriches a middle class that is now bending towards being more demand driven and not export. Your export engine is going to diminish. Not that they're not exporting a lot, they still are. But when you want your consumers enriched, when you're trying to develop a middle class type economy. So all these things are afoot and they're there. And I think Jacob's points are well taken, and we'll see the way they play out going forward. But make no mistake that China has been a massive stockpiler of goods. As I like to say, some people take their central bank liquidity and buy Picassos and Ferraris and private jets. The Chinese have been taking it, and they've been taking their dollars, which they've, I think, really see as suspect, and buying things that they need and they use. I think that that's a very important difference going forward into the world.
Well, it's been a fascinating, insightful discussion. How can our listeners learn more about your work, Jacob?
You can, so I'm the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. You can find more information about that at cognitive.investments. You can also find, I've got my own podcast and kind of a free newsletter over at perchperspectives.com. I'm also a sadomasochist, so I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Jacob Shap.
And Ira.
I'm sorry, because I put out a blog last night. I don't write as frequently because I just don't want to get caught in this ridiculousness of some of the analysis that you have to fight. But I'm still writing Notes from Underground. And of course, the tagline, where 2 + 2 = 5, paying homage to the great Dostoevsky and the way that he sees the world is totally imbalanced. Not the way Orwell saw the 2 + 2 = 5, which is a totalitarian regime getting you to believe that because they could suppress you into believing anything. It's more that the world is just so imbalanced, and I love how Jacob introduced himself, which is seen outside that proverbial box. To me, there's no money to be made in that box. It's to be looked beyond. And it's like people say, why do you disdain Wall Street so much? Here, the only thing I have hanging on my wall is Shepard Fairey's picture of the public enemy of Wall Street, because my disdain for Wall Street. No, I don't make money on Wall Street. I make money from Wall Street, and that's because you can look outside of what they're selling, and you have to be able to look outside of that. So I applaud Jacob, and now I'm going to his site. So I will be a constant visitor, and hopefully people who listen to this will find your way, and I will talk about it in my blog. So hopefully this will start some relationship with us. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Richard, as always.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Ira, and Jacob. Thank you very much, and we'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you guys so much.
Yep.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.